This is For Keeps With You. Baxter Boys, Book 5. Written by Jessie Gussman. Performed by Jay Dyess. Episode 5, Chapters 14 through 16. Chapter 14. Dusty studied the rickety boat skeptically. It was a small rowboat, with just enough room for both of them and a picnic supper. They dragged the boat to the water's edge. "How about you get in first, then I'll push it off." The water was deep and slow in this part of the river. "Okay." She didn't have any better ideas. "I don't want you straining to get in and hurting your leg." "I see. I thought you figured if it capsized, you wanted me to be the one to get wet." "Huh, I actually hadn't thought of that, but I do see the wisdom." "Funny." She climbed in the boat while he held it. He straightened. "Or, if it leaks, you'll be the one to get wet first." He gave her a look. "I know how competitive you are." "That's one area where I'll let you win." He stood with his hands on his hips. "The first person to get wet or the first person to fall in the river?" "Both." "Wow, so generous." Bending down, he grabbed the edge of the boat. "Hold on, I'm going to shove it, then hop in. I guess if I don't make it, you'll have to row back to shore. Don't strain your back or ribs." "Oh, don't worry. I wouldn't dream of straining my anything. I'll just drift down the river, trying to catch fish to keep from starving to death, and eventually, when I get to the Atlantic, a passing ocean liner will pick me up. Watch for me on the news, and remember, it was all for the sake of not straining my back." Someone has a very vivid imagination. He started to push. Or a latent desire to be on TV. The back end hit the water with a splash. "Just shut up and get in the boat." His foot slipped and hit the edge of the river with a splash. Dusty had a very real fear grip her heart that he might actually not make it in the boat. But he jumped and landed with a thump. The boat rocked, and she held on to the edges with both hands. Roland plopped down in the seat across from her. "There, that wasn't hard." He looked around. "I have no idea of how we're getting out of the river. How far away do you think that ocean liner was? We could send up a flare." She raised her brows. "I think we're outfitted a little less well than the Titanic. There are no flares." "I suppose there's no lifeboats either?" Roland asked with quirked lips as he took hold of the oars. "This is the lifeboat." Dusty rolled her eyes, enjoying their banter. "Please tell me you can swim." Roland grinned. "Maybe we should have thought this through a little better." He tilted his head. "Seems like since I met you, my ordered life has tanked." "Could you phrase that differently, please?" He laughed. "I say we row upriver, so if I break an oar or something, we can always float down." "Sounds perfect to me." Dusty let her head fall back and enjoyed the glimpses of the bright blue sky through the dark green oak and maple leaves. The easy slap and dip of the oars through the water was as relaxing as the light breeze that brought the happy smells of summer mixed with the heavier river scents. Roland rowed in a steady, relaxed manner, his head turned, watching the bank of the river slide by. She gazed at the play of muscles under his shirt, the flexing of his biceps as he strained at the oars. He turned his face and caught her staring. "What?" She smiled and shook her head. "You must have rowed before." "Yeah, once or twice a long time ago. My brother and I were in Scouts for a year or so." "Oh?" He never really talked about his family. "My parents are pretty busy, and my grandparents are divorced, both sides, so it made for a shaky family. But one year, Graham took us to Scouts.
Your grandparents are still alive?
Yeah, some of them. We all get together at Christmas. My parents rent a big cabin in Tennessee, and we all gather there. They rent the cabin for 2 weeks, and people come and go.
Oh.
It didn't sound like a close family gathering, but no one in my family really has a traditional marriage with staying together and raising kids, being close. His eyes snagged hers. I guess, when I thought about it, I wanted to be the one.
The one?
The one that was different. I wish our family had been closer. If I have kids... His voice trailed off, and Dusty thought of the expression on his face as he held the baby that afternoon. If I have kids, I want them to have a mom and dad who are together and who are home. The oars continued a steady rhythm. My parents aren't divorced, but they were never home. My brother and I grew up in different worlds. Maybe Scouts was the only thing we really did together. Dusty didn't say anything, just ran a finger over the rough edge of the boat. Roland wanted a traditional marriage. Wife, kids, family. She wanted that too, she supposed. But she wanted a championship more. Didn't she? They continued on in silence.
Hey, aren't those the picnic tables for Riverside Park?
Dusty pointed to the water's edge. I think you're right. Want to stop and eat?
You have to be getting tired.
I keep telling myself it will be very relaxing when we're floating downstream. He angled the boat toward the dock.
If we do this again, I'm going to take a turn rowing.
We should have launched from here. That dock will make everything easier. She twisted carefully to look behind her at the approaching dock.
I noticed you just ignored me.
I'm sorry. I'm just not sure I can ride in a boat, relaxing, while you row. It'd feel weird.
Because I'm a woman?
He shrugged. She let it go. She supposed she couldn't get upset about it. It was nice when he opened her door and treated her like a lady. That protection came as a package deal, more than likely. The boat bumped the dock, and he rose, rope in hand, wrapping it around the piling. It was a little more difficult for her to get out, but she managed with his support. He tied the boat and grabbed their lunch. It was a beautiful day, and about half of the picnic tables were in use. They were still able to get one close to the dock. Several children ran around with a dog. A couple strolled along the river's edge. 3 college-aged guys threw frisbees.
I appreciate you doing this with me today,
Dusty said as they sat. He must have noticed something in her tone, because he looked up. Still thinking about the race yesterday?
Yeah.
She fiddled with her sandwich wrapper. You really miss it?
In some ways, it's getting easier the longer I'm away. In other ways, the longer I'm gone, the better I get, the more I can't wait to get back.
She looked around at the bright blue sky and perfect summer day.
A day like today, it really makes me wish I were racing. I want to be out on the track, practicing. I appreciate the distraction.
His lips flattened, then he smiled. What had displeased him? Was he upset that she still wanted to race? Maybe she shouldn't have been so honest with him. After all, he admitted that he was ready to settle down with a wife and kids and the whole deal. She just wasn't. He sat, looking out over the water, and she watched him. Holding the baby today had shocked and surprised him, but there had been something more in his expression. Her own heart had flipped and sizzled. There had definitely been a shifting inside of her to see Roland holding a baby. She'd sometimes looked at her friends and wanted the baby and family thing. She was never jealous exactly, but she did want that. She wanted a man who loved her as deeply and as fiercely as her friends' husbands. But that didn't mean she was ready to give up everything she'd worked for in motocross. Maybe once she won the championship. Or maybe after she won the championship and defended her title. She took a slow bite of her sandwich. That would be years. Roland was ready now. Would he wait for her? She shoved those thoughts aside as they finished their lunch and packed up the garbage. "Want to stroll for a few minutes before we head back downstream?" Roland asked once they had everything put away. "Sure," she answered. Maybe she wasn't what he wanted or what he needed, but they could enjoy today together. Tomorrow had its own problems to face. He took her hand and walked slowly down toward the river. The other couple had disappeared, along with the kids and the dog. In fact, only one table was still in use, and those people were packing up. "It'd be nice to have a house along the river. It's so peaceful." He grunted. "I love the water, but I wouldn't want to be peeking fearfully out my curtains every time it rained." "Good point. I suppose there's a downside to everything." He gave her a telling look, but she wasn't sure what he was hoping she'd figure out. "You could say there's an upside to everything. That's putting a positive spin on it," he finally said. "Okay, there's an upside to everything, even floods," she laughed. "Because you get to live beside the river, so you have to take the good with the bad." "I'll go along with that." They had made it to the water's edge. It gently lapped at the shore as it flowed by, deep and smooth. Somehow she had turned to face him. Had he pulled her? She wasn't sure, but she put a hand on his chest. It was hard under her hand, with a strong heartbeat. She swallowed and raised her eyes to meet his. His gaze was hooded and almost fierce. Her chest contracted, and she licked her lips. His eyes lowered as his hand came up and pushed through her hair. "Someday you're going to have to let this down for me." Without taking her eyes from his, she reached up and pulled the band from her hair. Immediately, both of his hands were in it, threading through. "It's soft." She wanted to say if he liked it, she'd never cut it, but just a few minutes ago, she had wondered if he'd wait for her. She couldn't promise a man she wasn't going to be with that she'd never cut her hair for him. So she bit her tongue and closed her eyes. His hands were warm and relaxed and somehow sensual as well. "Dusty," he whispered. Her breath hitched and she opened her eyes. His face was only inches from hers. She slid her hands up his back as his lips touched hers. The same crazy hot fireworks went off in her body as the last times he'd kissed her. She wasn't sure how much time had passed when he finally raised his head. Both of them were out of breath, and she was pressed against him, unsure if she could stand on her own. He rested his forehead against hers, his eyes closed. "I want so much more from you than you want to give." She wanted to tell him she'd give him whatever he wanted, but something held her back. Instead, stupid words came out of her mouth. "What about Janice?" But he didn't get offended, didn't lift his head, although he did open his eyes. "I forget about Janice when I'm with you." She forgot about motocross and championships when she was with him, especially when he was kissing her. But no one had ever stayed with her, not even her parents. Eventually, Roland would get tired. Maybe he wouldn't leave her, but she'd be on her own. She couldn't give up everything she'd worked so hard to reach for a man who might not be there for her. So, She just held on tight to him and didn't say anything. Chapter 15. Your therapy report is excellent. You can take the brace off, wearing it only if you're tired. But try not to overdo it and get too tired. The doctor looked at Dusty over his iPad. She nodded, trying to contain her excitement. There was more, she could tell. And you can drive. This time she didn't bother to hide her full-on smile. The doctor smiled back. I know you've been waiting for that one.
You have no idea,
Dusty said. The paper on the exam table crinkled under her as she wiggled, unable to keep still. The doctor lifted his brows and looked back at the tablet. If you want, you can ride a motorcycle now, but I wouldn't if I were you. They're dangerous. However, as we discussed at your first appointment, no more racing. Dusty quit breathing. All the excitement that had been bundled in her chest drained like a flat tire.
Huh?
The doctor clicked and swiped on the tablet, not even looking up. As we talked about before, you're never racing again. Dusty's body felt like a cement block, but somehow she got her tongue to work.
We talked about that?
Yes. The doctor looked over his glasses. In the hospital, before your first surgery.
I don't remember.
He must have seen her truly poleaxed look. His brows drew together. Pulling the tablet closer, he clicked back through. Here are the notes. Patient has been warned of the risks associated with continued racing. The surgery can prevent paralysis, but the risks of not walking again with another accident, even one with less trauma, is extremely high. The entire team of doctors agree. Racing again would result in almost certain re-injury, paralysis, and possibly death. He looked up. This is your file. We did talk about this. At her continued shocked silence, he said, It's possible the painkillers you were on at the time have kept you from remembering, but there is no note here that you weren't lucid. There definitely would have been a note if anyone felt you weren't listening or didn't understand. Dusty drooped on the table. How could she have forgotten that the doctors told her she wouldn't race again? Had she blocked it out? Or was it really the painkillers? Obviously, it was a conversation they'd had since he just read that off her record. Her racing career was over. She couldn't pass the physical and be cleared to race. She really wasn't going to race again. Ever. Her brain seemed to be stuck on permanent slow. But a thought nagged around in the back until she finally scratched it out. Roland had seen the doctor's notes. Roland knew. Whatever the doctor said for the rest of the appointment, she didn't hear. She stumbled out of the waiting room, not even thinking to schedule her next appointment. Whenever it was supposed to be, she hadn't been listening. Eve, the dark-haired Baxter twin, waited in a plastic chair, reading something on her phone. She glanced up when Dusty came out, doing a double take, then popping out of her chair.
What?
She asked softly when she made it over to Dusty.
What is it?
Dusty shook her head. She could barely lift her gaze to look into Eve's sweet brown eyes, clouded with concern.
Let's go,
Dusty whispered.
Excuse me, miss. Are you going to make an appointment?
The receptionist called out the window.
She's talking to you,
Eve said low.
Not now.
Dusty was able to push out around the intense pressure in her chest
that seemed to be shoving her heart up toward her ears.
Eve shook her head at the woman and took Dusty's arm, guiding her slowly out the door into the bright June sun. Eve worked on diesel motors like her brothers, and she was strong and tough. Dusty appreciated her strength as she leaned into it. Her own strength seemed to be gone. She would never race again? Part of her wanted to know what the odds were. Couldn't she make that decision for herself? Weigh whether being paralyzed was worth the risk of winning a championship? The sensible part, currently a very small part, told her that was ridiculous, and she knew it to be true. And her heart, she couldn't even think about what her heart was saying. Roland had known. He'd allowed her to go on about getting better, racing again, winning the championship, and all along, he'd known. Eve guided her to the passenger side of her pickup and opened the door.
"Can you tell me what happened?"
Dusty swallowed.
"The doctor said I would never race again."
Dusty raised her tortured eyes to Eve's.
"Forget my therapy appointment."
Eve had barely shut the door before she had her phone out. Dusty supposed she was canceling her therapy appointment or possibly letting Roland know. Dusty wished she'd just let it alone. Eve took a few minutes before she came around the other side of the truck and got in. When they pulled into Dusty's drive, Kelly's and Harris's cars were already there, and Cassidy pulled in behind them.
"Eden's coming in a few minutes. She's bringing the ice cream and chocolate."
Eve put the truck in park.
"Give me a minute. I'll help you out." "I'm fine."
Everything else the doctor had said was good news. Kelly and Harris both threw their arms around her when she stepped out of the truck.
"Aren't you two supposed to be at work?"
Dusty said, fighting back the tears that threatened to fill her eyes.
"I took off. There's a volunteer at the library. She'll have to handle it,"
Harris said, still squeezing Dusty.
"We knew your parents wouldn't be around."
Kelly's tone implied just a little censure.
"And we knew how much this meant to you."
Dusty closed her eyes and let them hold her.
"Thanks."
Eve and Cassidy walked around the truck.
"I had already taken the day off because of my kids' doctor's appointments," Cassidy said.
Dusty opened her eyes.
"Where are your kids?" "The Kicking Quilters have them," Cassidy said,
referring to the older ladies who used Torque's garage as their sewing headquarters.
"As soon as Eden shows up with the ice cream, we'll be set."
Eve joined the group hug. Dusty pulled her lips back, trying to smile.
"Thanks for calling, everyone." "You've been here for us. I knew they would all want to be here for you."
Dusty allowed their arms to seep comfort into her soul. Finally, she realized they were all still in the driveway.
"Let's go inside."
Chapter 16. Roland set the chart for his last patient on the counter. Dusty's chart still lay where they'd set it, waiting for her to show. She never had. He'd been able to get through the last 3 patients after her, but he was itching to call or text or, even better, just drive to her place. What had happened that she'd missed her appointment? Surely she wouldn't have forgotten. He suspected it had something to do with her doctor's appointment today. His heart pinched every time he thought of the doctor possibly telling her what her chart had said for weeks. His whole being ached to be with her. Normally, he checked the charts for the next day, just to get his mind focused on the best ways to help the patients coming in. But he left as soon as he set the chart down for the last patient. Abigail smirked at him as he left. He gave her his most professional smile. Their supervisor was out at a training seminar and wouldn't be back until later in the week. He didn't have to worry about what Abigail might have told him until then, but he was fairly confident that everything would be okay. He was a very valuable employee. His reputation brought many big-name clients into the practice. He was good at what he did, and he'd never stepped 1 foot even close to any boundaries. He was never late. He was the most requested therapist. He was handed the hardest jobs. It's possible that their supervisor might reprimand him, but he highly doubted it. He definitely wasn't worried about his job. All of his concern for today was on Dusty. He drove directly to her house from work. It looked like she was having a party. He recognized Kelly's car, and he thought he recognized Cassidy's. Maybe a girls' night. Maybe he should have called, but he rejected that thought as soon as it came. He had as much right to be with Dusty as anyone else, and she missed her appointment. So he strode to her door and knocked boldly. One of the twins answered. He thought it was Eden. She smiled when she saw him, but her eyes were wet.
There's a lot of emotion going on in here. You sure you want to come in?
What happened?
Dusty can't race again.
Eden gave him a level look.
You're not her favorite person right now. She claims you knew and made a fool out of her.
Roland froze. Thoughts raced through his head. He hadn't considered that she would blame him in any way. Should he have told her? He knew it would devastate her, and he hadn't felt like it was his position to give her that news. He had also been concerned that it would cause a major setback in her recovery. He thought the doctors might have withheld the information on purpose for that very reason. He ran a hand through his hair, hating the thought that Dusty was angry with him, but thinking that if he could go back, he'd do the exact same thing. He could apologize, but he couldn't claim to think he had been wrong. He met Eden's accusing stare. She's right. It was written right in her record. I did know. But that wasn't my information to tell. I assumed there was a reason the doctors didn't tell her. Eden shifted.
She said the doctor today claimed he did tell her. He read right from her record that they'd talked about it. She just didn't remember. She's not sure if it was the painkillers she was on or if the news was so awful she blocked it out.
Eden hadn't made a move to open the door farther, and for the first time, Roland wondered if she was going to let him in. Is she refusing to see me? Eden's eyes widened and she straightened, opening the door.
No, sorry. I'm actually glad someone is here. We've been with her all afternoon, but we're leaving.
As she spoke, Kelly, Tuff's wife, came to the door, purse over her shoulder. She was blonde and bubbly, and even though her eyes were red from crying, she gave Roland a perky smile.
I'm so glad you're here.
Eden backed away from the door and disappeared inside. Kelly continued in a lowered voice.
Tuff said you're the man for Dusty. His only concern was that Dusty wouldn't realize it until it was too late.
Roland's eyes widened at her whispered confession. Tuff thought Roland should be with Dusty? He tried to remember if Tuff had ever even really seen them together. Kelly patted his arm.
She's not very happy with you right now.
That made the nervous clenching of his stomach worse.
But Tuff's never wrong.
She started out the door.
You are staying, right?
For a while. He'd just been planning on checking on her, seeing why she missed her appointment. Kelly made it sound like he should be moving in.
Good. She shouldn't be alone right now. I don't think she even bothered to call her parents.
Okay. Roland took one step in the house and met Eden coming back out with her twin, Eve beside her.
"You've got the next shift," Eve said with a small smile. "If she doesn't shoot you first."
Roland blinked, hoping she was kidding. With women, sometimes it was hard to tell. Harris, Turbo's wife, met him as he was closing the door behind the twins.
"Take care of her," she said.
"I'll try." She opened the door and walked out. Roland felt like the baton had been passed to him. He wasn't sure if he deserved that trust. He walked through the living room to the stairs and started down. Cassidy, Torque's wife, was still sitting with Dusty on the couch. Dusty had her head down, her hair shielding her face, an empty container of ice cream held loosely in her hand. Cassidy looked up at his approach. She squeezed Dusty.
"I'm leaving, but I'm going to call you later, okay?"
If Dusty replied, Roland couldn't hear. Cassidy bit her lip as she looked between him and Dusty. She got to her feet, taking the ice cream container with her. Roland should have thought to bring something, but he hadn't realized exactly what had happened. Cassidy stopped in front of him and whispered,
"She's taking it pretty hard. I'm not sure which was worse, though, not being able to race or knowing that you must have known."
Her voice dropped even lower.
"I didn't realize how much she cared about you."
Roland looked at the floor. Should he have told her? The question wouldn't even have made sense for anyone else. It wasn't his place. But it did his heart good to hear Cassidy say Dusty cared about him. Maybe there was a small ray of hope. Cassidy held up the ice cream container.
"I'm throwing this away on my way out. Call me if she needs me."
Roland nodded, feeling strangely deserted as Cassidy walked away. There were a few sounds, then they faded as she went up the stairs. Finally, the door opened and closed, and he was alone with Dusty. She hadn't moved. He walked slowly toward the couch, moving around the end and going to where Dusty sat in the middle, with her shoulders hunched and her back bent, her head pointed down toward her knees. The silky blonde hair that so fascinated him hung around her head like a soft blanket. His hand itched to run over it, soothing, but he shoved it in his pocket instead. He swallowed, loud in the stillness of the house. She didn't move or acknowledge him. The Dusty he knew was vibrant and alive and met life head on. The news that she couldn't race again really had devastated her. Kneeling in front of her, he carefully put one hand on her knee. She stiffened, but didn't move. "Dusty." After a few seconds, her head shifted, her hair parted, and her face came into view. Red and blotchy, her eyes bloodshot and swollen, she looked at him. His heart beat painfully. His arms itched to hold her, but he wasn't sure she would welcome his comfort, although she'd made no move to remove his hand from her knee. "I'm sorry," he breathed out. Not sorry for not telling her. Maybe sorry for not being able to tell her. But sorry that she couldn't race again, that something she loved with all her heart had been taken from her. Her head moved back and forth as she shook it slowly.
"No."
"Yes, I really am. It kills me to know how much this means to you, and how bad it hurts for you to find out that it's not something you can do anymore." She bit her lip and closed her eyes at his words. There was no hatred in her expression. She didn't even look angry. Just devastated, which hurt his heart more than all the anger in the world.
"It's not your fault,"
she said so softly he had to strain to hear. "No, but that doesn't keep me from hurting for you." Her head came up.
"You knew."
It was a statement, and he couldn't deny it. Yes.
Why didn't you tell me?
At least he was prepared to answer this. I didn't know why the doctor hadn't told you. I was only the therapist. The stuff in your record is to help me treat you better, not for me to share. Her forehead crinkled and her eyes filled.
I thought I was more to you than just a patient.
Roland swore. This was why he shouldn't have gotten involved with a patient. You are. He closed his eyes against the need to pull her close. You're so much more.
Then why?
It wasn't my place. I knew it was going to hurt you. I didn't know why the doctor hadn't told you.
I went on and on about how much I wanted to race again, and you were laughing the whole time.
Her voice was no longer soft. I wasn't laughing. His hand had tightened on her knee, and he made himself loosen it. I wasn't laughing, he said softer. It sent pain through me every time you said that. Yeah, I knew what your record said, but I care about you, and I didn't want to be the one to dash your hopes.
I was devastated, you're right, but I have had some time to process it and get used to the idea, and I know I can live with it. The issue that's lingering is that you knew. You knew.
She emphasized those two words.
And you didn't tell me.
The emotion on her face was betrayal, like he had betrayed her trust. It sent burning pain down his throat and through his chest. I'm sorry. I couldn't.
I thought at first you were hiding it for some competitive reason, but I couldn't think of any time you've been anything but considerate and kind to me. My brain knows you couldn't tell me.
Her eyes squeezed shut.
But there's something else, my heart maybe, that feels like if you truly cared about me, you would have told me.
I swear I care about you. He moved closer and slid his hand over her hot, wet cheek into her hair. It's killing me to not be able to fix this. His heart leaped when she leaned her head into his hand. He cupped her head, pulling her closer.
I trusted you,
she said raggedly. I didn't betray you, he whispered. I considered telling you, even though it wasn't my place, but I worried it might set your recovery back. I thought that's why the doctor might not have told you.
I know. I believe you. In my head, I know you want the best for me. My heart just hurts right now.
His did too. I want to hold you. After several beats of his heart, she twitched, then slid off the couch and into his arms. He wasn't expecting it and lost his balance. With his arms wrapped around her, they fell backward together, lying on the soft carpet, Dusty tucked in his arms. Her tears hit his chest, scalding. Feeling her cry hurt him worse than anything he could ever remember. But there was a coolness in his body, too. Relief that she didn't hate him, that she hadn't turned from him, and hope that she would understand and forgive. Dusty clung to Roland. She didn't care that they were on the floor. She didn't even care that he'd seen her looking awful, as she always did when she cried. Logically, she'd known her friends were right. They'd comforted her, and when she'd complained about Roland knowing, they'd assured her that he'd not kept it from her out of selfishness or unkindness. Her brain had known that they were right, but
like she told Roland. Her heart hurt.
It helped that he'd come. He had to have left work and come immediately to her. His arms around her, his ragged whisper of apology, the pain she saw in his eyes over her hurt, it all helped. He tucked her head under his chin, and their legs tangled together. His arms pulled her closer, and she snuggled into the shelter they provided. She didn't know how long they stayed like that, but her tears dried up as the darkness fell. The lack of light gave her a feeling of safety, buffered by Roland's arms, and she spoke.
I've spent my whole life working toward winning a championship.
Her voice felt loud in the silence of the room. Roland's hand moved over her back. And I'm sure you could have done it. No one doubts your determination.
It's hard to let that go.
Sometimes it's easier if you replace it with something else.
There's nothing that could take the place of what I've done my whole life.
He was quiet for a few minutes, his hand stroking gently, soothing. Was it the thrill, the challenge, the competition? Dusty closed her eyes. He was trying to help her. Her friends commiserated, but Roland wouldn't let her wallow. He was trying to get her to pick herself up. And he was right. She didn't want to wallow. She'd spent a few hours grieving. She'd need more time. How much time? She wasn't sure, but she'd need more than just an afternoon to fully recover. But he had a good point. Replace. Isn't that what a rebound relationship was? People helped themselves recover by replacing one relationship with another. Why couldn't she recover from this by replacing motocross with...
I love the competition,
she finally said.
I love pushing to win. But I guess it doesn't have to be against other people. I can compete against myself.
Okay. So we'll think of something that doesn't necessarily have to be a competition against other people. She sighed.
I suppose I could work on building a design business. That would provide the competition that I crave, but...
Roland's hand had found its way to her hair, and he ran it through his fingers. So gentle and careful, she couldn't help but close her eyes and enjoy. But... he prompted. Where had she been? Oh.
But I love the danger, the risk. That makes the victory sweeter.
You probably won't get that in the design business, unless you get hired by a drug lord. Do they have websites? Roland asked with a lot of humor in his voice. She smiled, surprised, because a few hours ago, she would have said that it would be a long time before she smiled again. Yet, here she was.
I don't think that's the kind of danger I'm looking for.
He breathed out an exaggerated sigh of relief. Whew, I'm happy about that. I'd hate to get kidnapped and held as ransom just because they didn't like the font you'd used. She chuckled with him. He cleared his throat. Quit making jokes. I'm trying to figure out a new, slightly dangerous, competitive activity that will keep my fake girlfriend happy but also safe. Maybe it was time to lose the fake part of girlfriend, but she kept her mouth closed. After all, if they hadn't had more than a patient-therapist relationship to begin with, she wouldn't have felt betrayed when he didn't tell her what was in her chart. She let it go. Mountain climbing? Roland asked.
Hey, that's not a bad idea. We could do that together.
I'd hike up the Appalachians, nothing bigger.
If you're mountain climbing, the goal has to be Everest.
She shrugged.
Aim for the top.
Roland gave a little snort. It's kind of hard for me to believe that motocross is out, but mountain climbing is in anyway. What exactly did the doctor say?
He didn't say no mountain climbing.
Maybe he didn't feel like he had to go through the whole shebang of what you couldn't do, Roland said reasonably. Dusty stuck out her chin, even though he couldn't see it.
Then maybe he should know me better, because if he didn't say no, then I assumed it's a yes.
His hand smoothed down her hair, holding the back of her head like he could protect her. I'm definitely talking to that doctor. He could, too, and probably would.
Whoa, you cannot use your job to manipulate your fake girlfriend.
When it comes to fake girlfriends, I need to use everything at my disposal. This is rough territory.
What's that supposed to mean?
He moved so that his forehead and nose touched hers. It means, Dusty Gibson, that I care about you, and I don't want anything to happen to you. And if I need to talk to your doctor so that we will know exactly what is going to keep you safe, I will.
But you're the one who said I should replace motocross with something else.
Me. You can replace motocross with me, he said, just before he lowered his head even more and ended the argument. Hi, this is Jay, and thanks for listening. If you're ready for another great audiobook, here's one we think you might like. Or check out the playlist with all our latest releases. Don't forget to subscribe to Say with Jay, give this video a thumbs up, and tell us what you liked in the comments.